statistics and research methods that he has to try to narrow down who this person is responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. What is your profile for who this suspect could be?
Just in. New surveillance footage in Nancy Guthrie case exposed. What was on it changes everything. Some cases begin with a scream. Some begin with a door left open. Some begin with a phone that never gets answered. Nancy Guthrie's case began with silence. Not the silence of an empty house. Not the silence of a woman who simply stepped away. But the kind of silence that arrives after something has already gone terribly wrong. The kind that settles in slowly, quietly, and by the time anyone notices it, it is already too late.
According to reporting tied to the investigation, that hired vehicle may have provided one of the final, independently documented recordings of Nancy alive, physically stable, and behaviorally calm. Federal agents reportedly reviewed that footage, and what makes this so disturbing is not what the video allegedly showed, but what it didn't.
On the night of January 31st, 2026, an 84-year-old woman returned home to her Tucson, Arizona neighborhood after a quiet family dinner. She was calm. She was familiar with her surroundings. She had done this 1,000 times before. And then, sometime in the hours that followed, Nancy Guthrie vanished. Not gradually, not ambiguously, gone. And what investigators would uncover in the weeks that followed would not simply shock a community. It would fundamentally alter how anyone understood this case from the very beginning. Because there was footage. Hi viewers, Nancy Guthrie was last seen alive on the night of January 31st, 2026. Do you think the person responsible for her disappearance was someone she already knew? Drop your answer in the comments right now. That question is not hypothetical. It sits at the very center of everything investigators have been quietly piecing together since the night this woman disappeared from a neighborhood where nothing like this was ever supposed to happen. Now here is what made this case different from the moment it emerged.
Yeah, Trim and Troy, good afternoon to you both. You may remember Friday night. This was a big night in this investigation when very late at night, law enforcement were executing a search warrant here in the Catalina foothills area. It was this home just over my shoulder. It's only about 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's own home. They were also taking a pretty close look at a Range Rover that was parked at a Culver's just a couple of miles away from here as well.
Nancy Guthrie was not a woman who lived carelessly. She was 84 years old, yes, but by every account she remained sharp, independent, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of her own life. She knew her home. She knew her neighborhood. She knew her routines. And on the evening of January 31st, she followed those routines exactly as she always had. At approximately 5:32 in the evening, Nancy left her Tucson home inside a hired vehicle, heading toward a family dinner. Nothing about her departure appeared unusual. Nothing about her demeanor raised any visible concern. To anyone watching, this was simply an elderly woman going to spend an evening with the people she loved. But investigators would later learn that someone may have been watching. And not just on that evening. Nancy arrived at the family dinner. She spent hours in what witnesses would later describe as a calm, entirely routine setting. No visible distress. No unusual behavior. No indication whatsoever that she believed anything in her world was wrong. And then, at approximately 9:48 in the evening, she returned home. Her son-in-law, Tommaso Sion, was publicly identified as the last known person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. 2 minutes later, at 9:50 p.m., the garage sequence at her home completed. And then the darkness began. By 1:47 in the morning, surveillance visibility in and around the property was critically interrupted. Not malfunctioned. Not faded. Interrupted. And by approximately 2:28 a.m.
There is a moment in every investigation when everything changes. Not because of one dramatic discovery. Not because of a single piece of evidence. But because the story someone has been telling stops matching the facts.
Nancy's pacemaker, the medical device quietly monitoring her heart from inside her own chest, transmitted what would become its final meaningful signal. After that, nothing. No movement. No trace. No Nancy. What followed was one of the most disturbing disappearances in modern Arizona history. Federal agents became involved. The FBI extended its reach into the case. A reward was established. National media began paying attention. And still, publicly, answers remained painfully out of reach. But now, something has changed. New information surrounding surveillance footage connected to Nancy Guthrie's final hours has begun to surface. And what that footage reportedly captured, and perhaps more importantly what it failed to capture, is sending shockwaves through the investigative framework surrounding this case. Because this is not simply a story about a missing woman. This is a story about what was already in motion long before anyone realized danger had arrived. And the footage may prove it. The hired vehicle footage was not supposed to matter. That is the part that makes it so important. When federal agents reportedly reviewed the recording captured during Nancy Guthrie's ride on the evening of January 31st, 2026, they were not necessarily expecting a revelation. A routine review. A box to check. A timeline point to confirm. But what that footage allegedly showed, and the specific detail buried inside it, would quietly become one of the most psychologically significant pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Nancy was calm. Completely. Entirely. Undeniably calm. No visible anxiety. No darting eyes. No trembling hands. No whispered words suggesting fear. No behavioral signal of any kind that indicated she believed her world was anything other than ordinary. She was simply an 84-year-old woman riding to dinner, the same way she had likely done dozens of times before, comfortable in the rhythm of a life she had built over decades. And that is exactly what disturbed investigators. Because in cases involving planning, concealment, and strategic operation, victim awareness is not a minor detail. It is a fundamental investigative signal. When a victim displays no fear in the hours before they vanish, it does not mean danger was absent. It often means danger was hidden, positioned, already operational, moving quietly around the victim without ever triggering the internal alarm that human instinct is designed to sound. Nancy Guthrie's instincts never fired. Think about what that means. If she felt no threat at 5:32 in the evening, then whatever was coming for her had not yet revealed itself. It had not made a sound. It had not shown a face. It had not done anything to disturb the surface of her ordinary evening. And yet, within hours, everything would change. That gap between her visible calm and the darkness that followed is where the real story lives. Now, the rideshare driver has been described by investigative analysts as one of the most underutilized potential witnesses in this entire case. And the reason is simple. Unlike family members, unlike neighbors, unlike anyone embedded in Nancy's personal world, the driver was a stranger.
But on the night of January 31st, 2026, that silence was weaponized.
An independent observer with no emotional history, no loyalty, no reason to interpret what they saw through any particular lens. Just a person doing a job, watching a passenger, recording an ordinary ride. That independence is extraordinarily valuable. Federal investigators reportedly examined not only the video itself, but the full behavioral context surrounding it. Nancy's posture, her words, her arrival conditions, the environment outside the vehicle, any unusual vehicles nearby, any environmental details that might seem insignificant in isolation but carry weight inside a larger pattern. And all of that may now exist inside sealed investigative files, which raises a question that has quietly unsettled the public discussion around this case. If federal agents reviewed this footage early in the investigation, why did local law enforcement responses create apparent confusion about whether additional visual evidence even existed? Journalistic sources suggested federal authorities had secured the recording. Local responses reportedly told a different story. The contradiction was never cleanly resolved. Was the footage insignificant? Was it compartmentalized? Was information being withheld strategically to protect the integrity of an active investigation? Nobody answered that cleanly, and the silence around that question has only deepened as the case has continued. But here is what that silence may actually mean. In major federalized investigations, local authorities and national agencies often operate with entirely different pools of information. The public narrative and the investigative reality can exist in completely separate spaces. What the public knows and what federal agents know may be separated by an enormous evidentiary distance. And that distance is not always accidental. It is sometimes deliberate. Because protecting the framework of an active investigation sometimes requires allowing public confusion to exist rather than risking exposure of strategic evidence. And if that is what happened here, then the footage of Nancy Guthrie riding calmly to a family dinner may have already been integrated into a much larger behavioral and timeline model, one the public has not yet been allowed to see. That model may be telling investigators something profound. If Nancy displayed no anxiety, then the threat was not visible to her. If the threat was not visible to her, then it was concealed. If it was concealed, then someone made the deliberate decision to remain invisible until the precise moment they chose not to be. That is not impulsive behavior. That is not panic. That is not opportunity seized in a moment of weakness. That is patience. And patience in criminal architecture is one of the clearest separators between reactive offenders and strategic ones. Reactive offenders act on emotion. Strategic offenders wait. They study. They reduce uncertainty. They choose their moment carefully. And when they finally move, the movement appears sudden to everyone except the person who planned it. Nancy Guthrie's final ride may have captured the last visible proof of a woman who still believed her life was safe. And if investigators can prove that her life was already anything but safe at that moment, then that footage does not simply document transportation. It documents the final chapter of a deception, one that had likely already been running for longer than anyone initially realized. And that possibility is what made investigators stop looking only at February 1st and start looking backward, weeks backward, into territory that would reveal something far more disturbing than a single night of violence. Someone may have been watching Nancy Guthrie long before she disappeared, and the evidence to support that possibility was hiding in plain sight. Here is the detail that changed everything about how investigators understood this case. When law enforcement reportedly requested neighborhood surveillance footage from January 11th and January 23rd, the investigative implications of that request were enormous. Because detectives do not reach back 3 weeks before a disappearance without reason. That kind of request does not emerge from routine procedure. It emerges from a specific suspicion, a pattern someone noticed, an anomaly that pointed backward in time and said something was already wrong before the night everything went dark. January 11th, January 23rd, January 31st. 3 dates, 3 potential windows. 3 points along what may have been a deliberate and carefully constructed operational timeline. Now consider what pre-crime surveillance actually means in a case like this. It means someone may have been studying Nancy Guthrie's life with intention. Her departure times, her return patterns, her family visit schedule, the rhythm of her garage, the reliability of her neighborhood security systems, the gaps in visibility, the windows of isolation, the moments when she was most alone and least protected. This is not the behavior of someone who acted impulsively. This is the behavior of someone who is building a map. And Nancy Guthrie's ordinary life was the territory being mapped. Think about that for a moment.
Because the man on Nancy's porch at 1:47 a.m. had a walk, too. And within hours, side-by-side comparisons were everywhere. The gait, the shoulder roll, the stride length. Thousands of people watching 2 clips on a loop asking the same question. Is that the same person? I am not here to answer that question with a TikTok overlay. I am here to show you something bigger.
Every morning she left her home at a predictable time, she may have been observed. Every evening she returned, she may have been clocked. Every gap in neighborhood foot traffic, every moment the street went quiet, every occasion when her home sat without visitors, all of it may have been cataloged. Not consciously by Nancy, not visibly to her neighbors, but systematically, deliberately, by someone operating just far enough outside the frame of normal life to remain invisible. This is one of the darkest truths in organized victimization. Routine is comfort. Routine is safety. Routine is the structure that allows ordinary life to feel stable and predictable. But to someone studying that routine from the outside with harmful intent, predictability is not comfort. It is a blueprint. And a blueprint can be exploited with enough patience and enough time. Nancy Guthrie had lived in her Tucson home for decades. She knew her neighborhood. She trusted her surroundings. She had no visible reason to believe that her familiarity with her own life had become a vulnerability. And that trust, that completely reasonable, completely human trust, may have been precisely what was used against her. Now investigators pursuing the pre-crime surveillance angle had to consider something even more uncomfortable. External observation alone has limits. From the outside, a watcher can learn departure times and arrival windows. But certain operational details require closer knowledge. Garage habits, security system configurations, household timing, interior blind spots, technological vulnerabilities. The kind of specifics that are difficult to establish through distant observation alone. This does not automatically implicate anyone within Nancy's personal circle, but it raises a question investigators in structured cases must always examine honestly. How much of what the offender or offenders knew was visible from the outside? And how much required access to information that only someone closer might have held? That question has not been publicly answered. And its presence in the investigative framework expands the suspect geography significantly. Because the more efficiently a crime is executed, the more investigators must examine how uncertainty was eliminated before it was attempted. Efficient crimes do not happen accidentally. They happen because someone did the work of reducing every possible variable. And reducing variables requires knowledge. Knowledge takes time to gather. And time leaves traces. Traces that investigators were apparently already finding weeks before the public realized there was anything to find. Now here is where the pacemaker detail becomes critical in the context of pre-crime planning. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker transmitted its final meaningful signal at approximately 2:28 in the morning on February 1st. That single medical data point created a hard timestamp, a biological clock frozen at a specific moment. And for investigators building a backward timeline, that timestamp was not just evidence of what happened at the end. It was a boundary marker, helping them calculate everything that had to have been in place before it. If someone studied her home for weeks, then February 1st was not an experiment. It was a conclusion. The pre-crime surveillance theory shifts this investigation from reactive crime into premeditated architecture. And premeditated architecture changes everything. Suspect profiles change. Behavioral models change. The geographic scope of the investigation changes. The definition of who could have done this changes. Because not everyone is capable of sustained, patient, invisible surveillance. That behavior narrows the field in ways that impulsive crime never could. And somewhere within those weeks between January 11th and January 31st, investigators may already have found the first thread. The thread that, once pulled, could begin unraveling everything. But even with surveillance footage, behavioral baselines, and a pre-crime timeline taking shape, there was still a central question that no amount of stationary evidence could answer on its own. Where did Nancy Guthrie go? That question belongs to movement. And movement is where this investigation may have created its most dangerous vulnerabilities for the people responsible. After Nancy returned home at 9:48 p.m. on January 31st, the window that followed was compressed, calculated, and consequential. The garage sequence completed by 9:50. Surveillance disruption arrived at 1:47 in the morning. The pacemaker went silent by 2:28. That is a narrow operational corridor. And narrow corridors demand efficiency. Efficiency demands preparation. And preparation, once again, points back to everything that came before. If Nancy was moved from her property during that window, then whoever was responsible immediately faced a challenge that no amount of prior planning could fully eliminate. They had to travel, and travel leaves evidence. Now, investigators working disappearance cases understand something that offenders frequently underestimate. A vehicle is not simply transportation. It is a mobile forensic environment. Hair, fibers, biological material, navigation history, Bluetooth pairing records, fuel transaction timestamps, toll pattern data, traffic camera captures at intersections. Even when a vehicle is cleaned, modern forensic techniques can frequently recover trace evidence that survives visual sanitization. The vehicle remembers things its occupants tried to make it forget. This is why any vehicle potentially linked to Nancy Guthrie's movements on the night of January 31st into the early hours of February 1st carries enormous investigative significance. Now consider corridor logic, a concept central to route reconstruction in cases like this. Offenders rarely move randomly. Movement typically reflects one of several patterns. A familiar route, chosen because local geography reduces navigational uncertainty. A remote route, chosen because distance from population creates concealment opportunity. A transfer route, suggesting broader coordination. Or a panic route, reflecting reduced control and emotional decision-making under pressure. Each pattern tells investigators something different about the person behind the wheel. A familiar route points toward local knowledge. A remote route points toward premeditated concealment strategy. A transfer route opens the possibility of additional participants. A panic route suggests the operation may have encountered something unexpected. Which pattern fits Nancy Guthrie's case? That answer has not been made public.
While Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and co-host of NBC's Today Show, had been visible everywhere, on television, at community events, in press conferences, her voice steady and then strained, and then something harder than grief. Tommaso had remained behind his lawyers, present in the background, silent in every way that mattered publicly.
But investigators building route reconstructions in Tucson's geographic environment had significant territory to consider. Urban corridors blending into suburban routes, industrial zones, open terrain, desert-adjacent concealment areas stretching beyond city boundaries. The range of possible movement pathways was wide, but not all pathways carry equal probability. And probability analysis narrows quickly when combined with digital evidence. Then there is the black glove. Found approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, the discarded item became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the public conversation surrounding this case. And while its significance to the formal investigation has not been fully disclosed, its location is worth examining carefully. Because discarded evidence along a route is rarely coincidental, disposal location reflects route sequencing. It can mark a transition point. It can indicate a moment of stress or urgency. It can reveal the general direction of movement. 2 miles from her home. That is not far. But it is far enough to suggest someone was already in motion. Now the pacemaker's final signal at 2:28 a.m. adds another layer to the movement reconstruction. Because pacemakers communicate through signals that have geographic range limitations. The silence that followed that final transmission may not simply indicate that Nancy's condition changed. It may indicate that she or her pacemaker moved beyond signal range, which means movement may have been underway or completed within a specific time window that investigators could mathematically model against known transmission ranges. That is a forensic thread with genuine investigative teeth. And for anyone who participated in moving Nancy Guthrie that night, the road itself may have been recording the entire time. Cameras at intersections. Timestamps at fuel stations. Phone location data pinging towers along a route. Navigation system logs that quietly archived every turn. The forensic battlefield expands dramatically the moment a crime transitions from a single location into a movement problem. And that expansion does not favor the people trying to hide. It favors the people trying to find. Now consider the psychological dimension of coordinated transport. If more than one person was involved in Nancy's disappearance, then the movement phase introduced an entirely new set of pressures. Multiple participants create multiple memories, multiple phones, multiple potential communication records, multiple opportunities for behavioral inconsistency. The stress of active operation under time pressure and in physical darkness creates conditions where people make decisions they later cannot fully account for. And inconsistent decisions leave inconsistent evidence. This is one of the reasons complex multi-participant operations tend to fracture. Not because the planning was poor, but because human beings under pressure are unpredictable. Someone stops somewhere they should not have stopped. Someone makes a call they should not have made. Someone disposes of something in a location that is later found. Someone later says something to someone that should have remained unspoken. And one fracture point is all investigators need. Nancy Guthrie may have left her home for the last time through a garage door that closed behind her without a sound. But the road that followed that moment was not silent. It was loud with evidence. Loud with digital signals, physical traces, behavioral decisions, and geographic choices that are extraordinarily difficult to erase completely. The question is no longer whether evidence of her movement exists. The question is how much investigators have already quietly assembled. And the answer to that question may be far closer than the public has been allowed to know. Because while the surface of this case has remained frustratingly quiet, beneath that surface something has been building. Something systematic. Something cumulative. Something that does not announce itself until it is ready. And when it is ready, it tends to move very fast. Cases do not break the way most people expect them to. There is no dramatic single moment where every piece of evidence suddenly assembles itself into a neat and obvious conclusion. Real investigations do not work that way. What actually happens is slower, quieter, and in many ways far more relentless. Evidence accumulates. Independent data streams begin reinforcing one another. Gaps narrow. Contradictions surface. And the architecture that was designed to hide the truth begins carrying the weight of its own structural complexity until, eventually, something gives. That is where the Nancy Guthrie investigation may now be positioned. Not stalled. Not cold. Building. Begin with the DNA. Few elements in this case carry more long-term forensic significance than the reported presence of unidentified male DNA profiles tied to critical evidence connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. If those biological signatures remain under active laboratory development, and particularly if advanced forensic genealogy has been applied, then what appears on the surface to be an open question may actually be a closing one. Here is why that matters so profoundly. Traditional criminal databases depend heavily on prior law enforcement contact. If a person has never been arrested, never submitted a qualifying sample, their profile does not exist in the standard system. That used to represent a significant investigative barrier. Forensic genealogy removed that barrier. Because genealogy does not require the individual. It requires their relatives, their family tree, their shared biological ancestry, distant cousins, second-generation connections. Partial matches that, when followed across branching family lines, can ultimately isolate a specific individual with remarkable precision. This means someone who has never once appeared in a criminal database may still be genetically visible, and they may not know it. That is the silent, accumulating pressure in this case that no physical concealment can address. Because a person can move a vehicle. A person can avoid cameras. A person can sanitize a space. A person can maintain silence for months. But a person cannot reach back into every relative's DNA and remove their own biological signature from a shared genetic inheritance. The biology remains. And the biology may already be speaking. Now pair that with the digital reconstruction dimension of this investigation. Modern federal forensic teams routinely recover evidence that suspects assume no longer exists. Deleted search histories. Erased navigation records. Cleared messaging applications. Removed location data. Each of these actions leaves its own ghost, a trace of deletion that forensic systems are specifically designed to identify. The attempt to erase is itself a form of evidence. Phones remember. Vehicles remember. Networks remember. And federal investigators have the tools to make them speak. Now consider the reward structure surrounding this case. A substantial reward has been publicly established in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. And while rewards are publicly framed as tools for encouraging outside tips, their deeper operational function is something more psychologically targeted. Rewards do not just invite information from strangers. They apply pressure to people already close to the truth. Peripheral participants. Low-level facilitators. People who know something but have not yet decided whether silence is worth the cost. When the cost of silence and the reward for speaking exist in the same psychological space, decisions change. Loyalties fracture. Fear of consequences shifts direction. Someone who felt protected 6 months ago may feel considerably less protected today. And that internal recalculation is something investigators understand deeply and deliberately cultivate. Silence in criminal networks is not a permanent state. It is a pressure-dependent one. Now here is the investigative reality that rarely gets communicated clearly to the public. When a case like this goes quiet for extended periods, it is almost never because nothing is happening. It is usually because everything is happening in spaces the public cannot see. Laboratory processing continues. Genealogical analysis advances through branching family trees. Digital forensic teams reconstruct timelines from recovered device data. Geographic analysts map movement corridors. Behavioral specialists examine consistency patterns across witness accounts. This work is not fast, but it is cumulative. And cumulative pressure is extraordinarily difficult to outrun indefinitely. Think about the structural vulnerability that exists in any operation involving multiple participants. Every additional person who knows what happened is another potential fracture point. Every shared communication is another data thread. Every coordinated movement is another behavioral record. The more people involved, the more decisions were made. And decisions leave traces. Traces accumulate. And accumulation eventually creates a picture that no amount of individual silence can fully obscure. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was independent. She was sharp. She was deeply familiar with the life she had built. She went to a family dinner on a quiet January evening and came home calm and unbothered, completely unaware that the hours ahead would mark the end of everything that had been ordinary about her world. That detail has never left this story. It sits at the center of everything. The calm, the routine, the complete absence of visible fear in a woman who had every reason to feel safe. And the devastating implication hidden inside that calm, that danger had already been positioned around her life without her knowledge, that she moved through her final ordinary hours entirely unaware of what was already in motion. That is not simply a criminal detail. That is a human tragedy of the deepest kind. And for Nancy's family, who have lived inside this suspended reality since February 1st, 2026, the absence of public resolution has not meant absence of truth. Truth is being built. It is being assembled from biological signatures, digital ghosts, geographic traces, behavioral inconsistencies, and the quiet, relentless pressure of a federal investigation that has not stepped back. Cases of this scale do not close quietly. They close with weight. And when the full picture of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance finally becomes public, it may not simply answer the question of what happened on a cold Tucson night. It may reveal the entire hidden architecture that was built around one woman's ordinary life without her ever knowing it existed. The footage captured her calm. The pacemaker recorded her silence. The road may have logged every mile that followed. And somewhere inside all of that, the truth is waiting. Not gone. Not lost. Not cold. Just waiting for the moment when everything that has been quietly assembling finally reaches the threshold where silence is no longer possible. And based on everything emerging from this investigation right now, that moment may be far closer than anyone involved is prepared for. Stay close. Because in the next video, investigators reportedly zeroed in on a specific name connected to the pre-crime surveillance window. A detail so precise, so quietly buried inside the early weeks of this investigation, that when it surfaces, it reframes every single thing you thought you already understood about this case. You will not want to miss that one.